Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. In today's episode, I speak with Callie about the loss of their first son, Coley, and how she created a legacy by creating an exhibition at President Lincoln's Cottage in Washington, D.C. Listen to Callie describing how she learned to intentionally grieve. And one thing to definitely look out for in this episode is how she experiences her grief loving her back. Callie says,
one thing I wish that I had known was that it is still possible to have a relationship with your loved one who has died. It's certainly not the relationship that you anticipate. It's not the relationship that you even necessarily wanted or had dreamed of or could have imagined. It is beautiful all at the same time.
Callie Hawkins is a grief activist and a bereaved mother whose son Coley died of unexplained stillbirth in February 2018, one day after his due date. In her professional role as a director of programming at President Lincoln's Cottage, a historic site and museum in Washington, D.C., where President Abraham Lincoln and his family moved after the death of their son Willie, Hawkins curated Reflections on Grief and Child Loss, an exhibit that connects the Lincoln family's experience with the death of their children with modern families who have lost children across age and experience. Callie, her husband Jason, and their living son Fletcher live with a deep and abiding love for Coley in the greater Washington, D.C. area. Besides the topics already mentioned, we discuss Callie's experience of her son dying from stillbirth, feelings of guilt and shame, and how she came to create Coley's legacy. I'm sure that you will enjoy today's episode as much as I did. Welcome, Callie. It's so nice to see you here today, and thank you so much for taking time for this podcast. How are you today?
Thank you so much, Natalie, for having me. I told my husband this morning that my grief is very close today, and usually what that means is that I'm excited to talk about my little boy and my family and all of the grief that has sort of brought me to this moment. So thank you for inviting me to share on your podcast.
Thank you, Callie. And this is a good moment to remind everyone listening here, this is an authentic podcast. We are here just as we are, with tears, without tears, whatever comes up is fine. So even you listening, just be welcoming whatever comes up. So why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about your story of loss and trauma?
Yeah, so in February 2018, after a completely normal pregnancy, I went into labor on my due date. My husband and I, did all of the things that you do as you're sort of rushing around. Even though it was my due date, we had not packed a bag for the hospital. So we were running around, getting ready to go to the hospital, and very excited for the arrival of our first child, a son, who we had anticipated for the past 9 months. And we got to the hospital and we parked the car, and I said to my husband, don't bring the bag in because I'm afraid I'm not far enough along and they're just going to send us home, and I'm going to be really embarrassed because this might not be it. What are the chances? It's our due date. When we got into the triage room, they connected me to all of the ultrasound, all of the equipment, and they couldn't find his heartbeat. And that was the first indication that we had that anything was wrong. This was a Monday. And like I said, it was his due date. And I had been to the doctor the Thursday before, and we had sort of high-fived and said, the next time we see each other, it'll probably be in labor and delivery. And, there was just no indication. And it was just a complete and utter shock to my husband and to me.
Yeah, I'm just listening to that. I can feel the shock of totally unexpected news. And then what happened?
Yeah, so, we were sort of given the options of how we wanted to deliver. And that felt a little bit surreal. I guess, it all just felt surreal. It was sort of like an out of body experience. We had to notify people, the last my family who lived out of town had heard from us. We were on our way to the hospital. And so we had to call them late at night. They had made the decision to wait until the next morning to come because we weren't expecting anything, to be wrong. So we knew that this could take hours. And so we had to make these phone calls to family members. And in our shock, we had to experience their shock. Yeah. And that sort of ripple effect, that sort of wave of just deep shock and immense grief was incredibly overwhelming. Yeah. For us. My doctor came to the hospital. She wanted to be with me, and even though she wasn't the doctor on call, she wanted to deliver our baby boy. And we delivered him at 6:33. I'll never forget it. 6:33 the next morning. Yeah. It was a Tuesday morning. It was February. I remember it was cold. And I remember, when he was born, we looked at him and knew that his name, Coley, it was my grandfather's name. We knew that it was the perfect name for this beautiful boy who was perfect. I mean, he had this gorgeous curly black hair, these long skinny feet, which my husband and I like to remember when he first saw them, he thought, these would be terrible soccer playing feet, which is soccer is something that my husband was really excited to teach him how to play. And we were just so in love and so completely in shock at the fact that this baby was never going to cry or walk or, go to elementary school. It didn't seem real. And at that time, I had been working at a museum and historic site here in Washington, D.C., where President Abraham Lincoln and his family moved after the death of their little boy. And throughout U.S. history, Mary Lincoln is someone who has been really maligned for her deep grief and deep depression and, been referred to by scholars and just society as a whole as quote unquote crazy. And I remember sitting in the hospital thinking, if society treats me the way they have treated her, that I will never survive this. And I couldn't get that out of my mind. I couldn't get that out of my head. I couldn't imagine how you experience that type of loss and live.
So already at that time, you were quite familiar with the Lincoln story, and this was sort of at the forefront of your mind.
Absolutely. Coley's due date was Abraham Lincoln's birthday. And I had been working at this place, at this cottage, which held them in their deep grief and in their trauma. I had been working here for 10 years. And so I was deeply sort of enmeshed in that story and, knew what society had done to her and had talked about it with deep compassion, but not, I think what I was feeling at the hospital in that moment was just this deep sense of knowing that you can't possibly know until you've experienced it.
Yeah. What a synchronicity that you've been working in that place for 10 years and been so close to their story and to their healing and to the way that the society's seen them, and then with your experience.
Yeah, and I think you bring up such an important point that for me, place. I've always been really rooted in a sense of place. My husband and I had just sold our house and moved 2 weeks before Coley was delivered. We'd moved into a rental house because the house we bought wasn't ready for us to move into yet. And so, the house where I spent my entire pregnancy didn't belong to us anymore. And the house that we purchased with Coley in mind, in a good school district in a small community where, he could grow up and really thrive, wasn't ours yet. And so we had moved into a rental house where the only things that we had unpacked were baby things. And it was completely disorienting. I think very early on attached a significance to this cottage, to this place that had held the Lincolns in their grief. It really has nurtured my broken heart for the last 4.5 years, just like it did theirs.
So how did you deal with your grief and loss early on in the process?
Very early on, I felt deep shame and guilt in ways that I think it must have come from the sort of idea that I had done something wrong or that I had caused this in some way. Yeah. And, Coley's stillbirth was unexplained. We don't have any answers. We know that it wasn't a cord accident, at least that the doctors could tell. And so all of the, some of the things that they typically look to, that wasn't the case for us. And so in my head, it could only mean that I had done something wrong, that if I had somehow noticed something earlier or eaten better in the last trimester or exercised more or something. And so I was fairly consumed by that pretty early on. And we immediately, my husband and I, started working with a grief counselor. And we have met with her religiously, weekly, for the past 4.5 years. And I think through that experience of weekly therapy with my husband, who was experiencing this grief in very different ways than I was able to make peace with the guilt and the shame fairly quickly, I think. Actually, thinking about that, I don't know that that's true. I think what I did probably quickly was acknowledge it and sort of talk about it. I don't know that I'll ever fully make peace with that.
Yeah.
But I think that I was able to give it a voice. And so when it crops up, I've been able to develop tools to sort of to move through that and to work with that.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that about the guilt and the shame, because that's something I hear over and over again from my clients, that mothers who have had a stillborn or an early loss, or, in any case, a loss, I would say with mothers that they feel, what have I done wrong? Is there something that I could have contributed, or was it my fault? And that is something that I'm sure a lot of the listeners will say, yes, me too. The most that hopefully someone can do at the beginning is normalize that this is a common experience. And then, as you were saying, I congratulate you for having searched for help and going to see a therapist if that is helping you, and it's not necessarily for everyone. I'm really glad that you're saying that this has been helpful for both of you and your husband.
It really has. I think we were in therapy probably 2 weeks after Coley died, and as I said, have been ever since then. And I think, especially early on, her help in normalizing these feelings, this anger that I felt at people who couldn't imagine Coley as the real 7-pound baby that I could, because I had seen him and they never had. Just knowing that all of those feelings that we were having were normal made me feel less like a pariah or an outcast. I'm constantly amazed when I talk to other grieving parents that this thought that I had really early on, that I thought, I must be crazy. Like, no one has ever thought about this before. To hear that they have also had those thoughts is really validating and comforting. In small ways.
And you mentioned that you and your husband had quite different ways of grieving. I'm interested in that, because as you know, my first book is talking about specifically that, how couples or people in general grieve in a different way. Would you like to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, my husband by nature is a quiet person. And I get the sense that big feelings aren't necessary. He's not as comfortable with big feelings. And when you lose a child, big feelings are going to come. And I think that he was probably less comfortable identifying, naming those, and really just talking about them. And so I was really surprised, I think, when we weren't sad at the same times or in the same ways or triggered by the same things, that when I was feeling a rush of those big feelings, I wanted to talk about them, and he kind of wanted to retreat. Part of what has been so tremendously helpful for our relationship and for us in therapy is learning how to best support each other when we're having those waves, and showing up for each other in the way that the other person needs, not in the way that we would need. And that has been particularly difficult for me, probably, because I do want to talk about all parts of this, because to me, it's all part of Coley's legacy. And when we talk about even the hard parts, we're creating memories of him.
Were there times when you didn't or couldn't or wouldn't grieve?
I've thought a lot about that. I don't know that I can think of a time when I couldn't or wouldn't grieve. I think that there have been times when I have grieved more intentionally than at other times. But for me, really early on, I recognized that I was going to have to completely surrender to my grief in order to find any kind of joy again. Like I said, I think at times that I did that more gracefully than at others, but it has really been all about just sort of giving my whole self up to this completely and allowing the time and the space to do that and to accept whatever comes along with that. Sometimes it's really beautiful. Sometimes it's awful. Sometimes I, feel like I don't want to get out of bed. And other times I feel like I want to shout Coley's name from the rooftop so that everyone knows that he is my most beloved.
Yeah.
But it's been giving into that fully that has really been the only way that I've been able to survive this.
I heard this beautiful quote, or maybe it was more like a visual story that someone shared with me that speaks to what you're just saying, which is, if we can go towards the grief and the pain and understand it, not cognitively, but from the heart, we can then walk through it or travel through it or journey through it and come out of it knowing that we are okay, that we are able to survive, and not only survive, but thrive after loss.
Yeah, I read something from that was written by Dr. Joanne Cacciatore not long ago, where she talked about, getting to a place where your grief loves you back. And at first I had no idea, how that sat with me. And then I realized that has been my whole goal, is getting to this place where, if my grief is my love for my son who died, and we are in relationship still, even though he's not here, then why couldn't I or shouldn't I expect that grief could love me back? And that to me has just opened my heart up to this whole new way of really thinking about and being in relationship, not only with my grief, but with my son who's not here.
Yeah.
I love that visual. I love, thinking, most people think about grief as this really dark, ugly cloud that just sort of hovers and is all encompassing. And if for me, shifting that visual to being, just this giant heart with open arms that is ready to fully embrace me, is really beautiful to me.
Thank you for sharing that beautiful image of that heart. One thing that I remember what you just said about 5 minutes ago or a couple of minutes ago was about intentional grieving. You mentioned sometimes I was more intentionally grieving. Can you explain what you mean by that?
I think it's several different things to me. I think that there are times when I would react or behave to something and wonder why that particular thing had sort of warranted that reaction. I couldn't necessarily see that was me showing up in grief. And then there have been other very specific decisions that I've made from a place of grief, like ways that we remember Coley through the holidays. Holidays are very important to us. And the first in our Christian tradition, Christmas is a very important holiday. And so I had set in place like all of these things to do to remember him at Christmas, because in my heart, I was preparing a holiday for a 10-month-old who should, be there and enjoying all of the sights and sounds and smells of Christmas. I needed him to be there in whatever way he could be. And so we planned all of these things. And so that was a way that I have very intentionally grieved, giving people framed copies of his picture.
Beautiful.
Those are ways that, that I have intentionally grieved. As I shared with you, I curated an exhibit at President Lincoln's Cottage called Reflections on Grief and Child Loss that connects the Lincolns' losses of their children. By the time they moved out to the cottage, they had 2 children to die of different illnesses in childhood. And I, curated this exhibit that connected their grief with the grief of modern families who have lost children across time and experience. And that was intentional on my part to sort of integrate Coley into every facet, every part of my life, because I knew if he were here, he'd be coming to work with me. He'd be, he would very much be a part of the way I show up for work. And that relationship didn't stop just because he died. I also knew, and with intention, wanted to in some way bring people who, like me, had, maybe felt alone and isolated in their grief in communication and in community with each other. That was going back to one of your earlier questions about, how did you do this early on? I kind of shut myself off. I allowed friends in, but, this was a time when all of my friends had young children.
Okay,
and it was so painful. Yeah, it was really painful to, as much as I was also the friend who loved my friends' children out loud, and it was really difficult to be around them, and so I in some ways kind of closed myself off from a lot of that interaction, and also didn't want to go to a support group early on.
Because there was just an important thing that I have encountered on and on again, where people in the surroundings of the grieving person might not understand, why is my child a trigger for you? Because it's not their fault, or they have nothing to do with that. And just to explain to those people, it's not that they have any fault, but it's just the being present around children, which is the wish of those mothers who have lost a child early on, or through pregnancy, or even in a pre or postnatal loss. That's like a trigger. It's like showing you the thing that you don't have. And some people, they might not understand it. And it's important to know it's nothing against the children of your, or not even against your friends. It's just a measure of taking care of your soul in that moment, that this is just too much.
Yeah. And, it's funny because my sister, my dearest sister, has 2 boys who, when Coley died, they were so anxiously awaiting the arrival of their cousin, and they remember him and they saw him, and they talk to me to this day about him and what they would love to be doing with him. They're now almost 13 and almost 10. So they well remember what he looked like, and can really articulate what they imagined their relationship would be like with him. And from day one, they gave me comfort in a way that other friends and other children just didn't. And my very best friend, her son was born a year to the day before Coley. So they share a birthday, but a year apart.
Yeah.
And that quietly gave me comfort as she would share on social media, memories from the year before. I could look and see, how I had imagined Coley at exactly that right time. And that child will always be special to me for that. And it's a gift that he and she probably had no idea that they were giving to me, because I couldn't necessarily talk about it, but it was beautiful to me.
As part of something that helped you, you also mentioned pre-recording, you mentioned your sister. Do you want to talk a little bit about how did she help you? How did she support you through your grief and loss?
She has really been everything to me. Like any siblings, I think probably especially sisters had some rough patches through the teen years, but as adults, she's been my best friend. And when Coley died, he was my first child, and the excitement that she held for her baby sister having a baby was so special. I knew that I couldn't call and tell her and give her this news that Coley had died. And so my parents did. And she was already on her way to be at the hospital with us. She was with us throughout his birth. Other than my husband and me and maybe the doctor, she's the first person who ever held him. And she walked with him down to the morgue because I couldn't.
Yeah.
And I will forever be grateful to the support that she has given. She made all the hard phone calls. She called the daycare. She called the pediatrician. She called insurance companies. She made all of those tough phone calls, and she found us a therapist. And I will just always be grateful to her for how she showed up for us in the midst of her own grief.
Yeah, exactly.
And I know it wasn't easy for her. And I just so appreciate her doing that for us, and in awe of the way she has grieved him, without much of that support, in return. And she's just navigated it all so beautifully, and finds ways to remember him and to make sure that her boys remember Coley. And she's just incredibly special.
Yeah, from what you were sharing last time, I remember that it sounds like she was really there to nurture the continuous relationship between you and Coley in a way that she was actually adding to it from her side, adding that connection even from the aunt to her nephew, that relationship that is ongoing, even if the physical relationship is no longer there.
My parents have done a really beautiful job of that too. And I think it's, in many ways it's different. They're grandparents, and they're worried about me. And so I think they could put their focus on, and needed to put their focus on making sure I was okay. And they remember Coley in beautiful ways too. And I think just having that special relationship with my sister where it was about him has just been extraordinarily special to me since day one.
I should probably talk to your sister and find out some of the suggestions that she would give other supporters. I mean, I think that's also really important, that's also the nature of the last book that I've written, Bridging the Grief Gap, to actually give that understanding to both sides, as to those who want to support equally to those who need to be supported. What would you wish you would have known at the beginning of your journey, of your grieving and healing journey?
One thing I wish that I had known was that it is still possible to have a relationship with your loved one who has died. And it's certainly not the relationship that you anticipate. It's not the relationship that you even necessarily wanted or had dreamed of or could have imagined. And it is beautiful all at the same time. And I think I wish that I'm so grateful for the opportunities that I have had to cultivate that and nurture that relationship. And I think I wish I had known that maybe earlier than I did. Of course, I'd give anything to have a 4.5-year-old here who is enjoying preschool and learning to swim and getting jealous of his little brother who is, now here. I would love for him to have had all of those experiences. I'd love for my husband and me to be able to experience all of that with him. And yet I can feel and I can see and I can experience every day the ways that he is still very much here with us. And it's beautiful.
And I think the exhibition that you mentioned before at the museum, that is also really a gift to his legacy or a testament to his position here. One question that I had there to circle back there is, when did you start with curating that exhibition? When was that after his birth?
It was about a year and a half after.
Okay.
My sister and I were walking in the cemetery where he's buried, and we were talking about, I was sharing frustration with myself that I hadn't started a foundation or that I hadn't started, some sort of activity in his name. And I said, I don't know, I want to find a way to help give him a legacy, and I just don't know what it is. And I just keep coming back to this deep shame and guilt that I had felt for all of that. And I said, just out loud, maybe there's something that I could do at the cottage that connects, all of these feelings and all of these experiences of President and Mrs. Lincoln, and maybe there's a way to connect them. And really had no idea that anyone else would be that interested in that connection. But I think, some of this goes back to that isolation. It astounds me the number of people who have made pilgrimages here to the cottage to visit the exhibit. And at the center of the exhibit is this structural weeping willow with leaves on it that you can remove, and you can write the name of a child or a loved one who has died and write a message and hang it back on the tree. And it astounds me the number of people who come to this place just to do that. And I think it really speaks to that need for community. And, we reached out to, I think, 10 families to see if they would share their reflections on different facets of grief after the loss of their children. And we expected that 5, would want to participate, and all of them wanted to participate. And so it's just been this really beautiful expression of love and loss and community. I think that started out as sort of my desire to help create a legacy for my son, and in a way that I felt deeply connected with the Lincolns.
Yeah. One of the ways in which the people that show up in terms of wanting to honor their children is also making a sign, making a mark that they mattered. No matter when the loss was, at what age, at what gestation, it's making the world known that they matter. And what we all have in common with those people that we lose is that there is an abrupt change in making new memories. And whether that's a young person or an old person, life stops. So making new memories stop. And especially when a child dies at a young age, or even premature, or in labor, or prenatally, then we can't even make memories beyond the pregnancies. And it's a way to make a sign that they mattered. And the picture that you drawn about the book, about the tree, So I've looked at the video that you shared with me, and I'm going to put that into the show notes. And it's just to paint it even more. I mean, the background is blue, a dark, beautiful blue, and then the tree is white, and it's shining like a light in this room. It's beautiful even to see that video. So I recommend those listening that you go and watch that video. And if you're close by, or if you want to do a pilgrimage, Washington, D.C. So to round this up, what would you say? How has your loss and trauma shaped you?
In so many ways, I don't even know that we have all the time to name them. I was reflecting on the birth of my second son, who was born just 7 months ago, and how just sort of natural it felt, and how I just sort of instinctively knew what to do. And I know that part of that is, this deep mothering instinct. But I think the biggest part of that is that I was already a mother, and I knew what that love was like. And I knew what that, I knew how to nurture. With Coley, I was not able to nurture, after a certain point, I wasn't able to nurture his physical being, but I've been able to nurture his memory. And that has completely shown me the way. For mothering and for nurturing my infant son. And I think my baby recognizes his place as the second child in the family. My sister, we spent some time together very recently, and both my parents and my sister acknowledged that he is the quintessential second child, like very easygoing and just sort of has this like really sweet disposition. And I love thinking about that. And I love thinking about the space that his older brother, even though he's not here with us, occupies in our family. I think I was telling you in our earlier conversation that I wrote an article for a museum professional journal called "My Grief is My Superpower," and I reflected on that idea a lot, because I think we tend to think of superpowers as this, these things that make us like powerful and all of that. And that's not what I mean. But what I mean is just this idea that I am emerging from the unbearable with this new set of skills, and this new set of tools, and this new set of this new way of being in the world that would not have been possible without the trauma that I experienced. And in that way, I'm as strange as it might sound, or as it might feel to say, I'm grateful for that opportunity.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Callie, for all that you've shared. And I'm just grateful that we've met through the circumstances that we've got together. Shall we go into rapid fire questions?
Sure, these are hard.
So basically, this is just a sentence starter, and I'm asking the same. It's not really questions, but I'm giving the same sentence starter to each and every one of my interviews, and it's just to make an end to the sentence. Doesn't have to be long, can be out of the top of your head, just to get an idea. Shall we start with that?
Yeah, great.
So grief and trauma means?
Grief and trauma means learning to live in the pain that comes when someone you love dies.
And healing means?
Healing means surrendering to that pain so that you can embrace the joy that comes with continuing to love them.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. And what I have learned about myself in the light of loss and trauma
is that grief is my superpower.
I'm going to link that article as well, because I love that. I even love that quote. I see that Superman cape in that picture. One thing I wish people knew about loss and trauma
is that the experience is unique and very personal.
One specific thing that has changed since my loss and trauma that I wouldn't want to miss.
I wouldn't want to miss any of it. I think there's a beauty in living in the both and, that I've come to love as a part of my experience. So I don't think I would want to miss any of it.
Well, thank you so much, Callie, for taking your time today and for sharing the way you have dealt with your grief and trauma. And I'm looking forward to seeing how this exhibition at the Lincoln Cottage, how this is going to evolve or maybe even travel.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the work that you do. It's been such an important part of my grief, and I really appreciate. I'm sorry for the circumstances that brought us together, and I'm just so grateful that you're here for people like us.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.